Okay, let's dig right into the material you sent over. This is some really fascinating stuff exploring these, well, potential links between ancient scripture and modern cosmology.
It really is. We're looking at sources that are asking a pretty big question, aren't they? Like, could a text from 1400 years ago actually have insights about the universe's birth? Insights science is only catching up to now.
It's definitely a compelling idea, and these sources, they really focus on specific points they believe show this connection. So our job in this deep dive is basically to unpack these claims, one by one.
Right. Look at the verses they mention, the science they're comparing them to.
Exactly, and really get a handle on what the sources are actually highlighting and how they're building their case.
Absolutely. And, the sources start sensibly, I think, by laying out the modern scientific picture first, how science currently sees the universe beginning.
Yeah, they set the stage with the Big Bang Theory. That's the main model, right? The
Sure.
idea being, what, about 13.8 billion years ago, everything, the whole universe, was packed into this incredibly dense, super hot point.
Like, everything we see and don't see squeezed into this initial state, sometimes called a singularity, though the sources don't always use that specific term.
And then, boom, basically.
Yeah.
This massive, rapid expansion outwards. That's the Big Bang event itself.
Exactly. And over billions of years, as this stuff expanded, it cooled down, started clumping together.
Forming stars, galaxies, planets,
Yeah.
everything we observe today. So, okay, that's the science backdrop the sources are using.
Right. Now, here's where they make that first connection they want us to look at. They shift from that scientific view to what they argue is a description in the Qur'an.
Uh-huh.
Specifically, they point to Surah Al-Anbiya. That's chapter 21, verse 30.
Okay, and that verse goes, "Do not those who disbelieve see that the heavens and the earth were a joined entity, and we split them apart?"
Yeah. And the sources really zero in on a couple of Arabic words there. For a joined entity, the word is ratqan.
That's one.
And the sources define that as meaning something like a tightly sewn seam or a completely fused, united mass, all one thing.
Okay, a single unit, and the second part, we split them apart.
That's linked to the Arabic word fatakahuma. And the interpretation the sources give this is pretty strong. To rip apart, tear asunder, basically a violent separation. Some even suggest it implies an explosion.
Huh.
Fatakahuma.
So the argument you see in the material is this. You've got Rotcon, this unified starting point, and Fatakuhoma, this violent splitting. They're saying that description lines up remarkably well with the Big Bang idea. The idea of the whole universe starting as one thing and then exploding outwards.
Precisely. They really emphasize how those specific words, in their view, capture the essence of that initial cosmic event. It's quite focused on the linguistics they present.
Okay, so that's claim number one from the sources. This unified start and the split. What's the next connection they draw?
Well, after the initial moment, the sources move on to what happened next, scientifically speaking, the expansion of the universe.
Ah, right. This was a huge discovery in cosmology, wasn't it? People like Edwin Hubble back in the early 20th century.
That's the one. Realizing that galaxies aren't static, they're actually moving away from each other. Space itself is stretching.
The universe is expanding.
Exactly. And the sources argue that this very concept, only really grasped scientifically in the 1900s, is also right there in the Quran. They point to Surah Ad-Dariyat, chapter 51, verse 47.
Okay, let's hear that one.
It reads, "And the heaven, we built it with might, and verily, we are expanding it."
We are expanding it.
And the specific word the sources focus on there is muzion. That's the phrase translated as "we are expanding it."
Museo.
And what they really stress, what the material emphasizes, is the tense of that word in Arabic. It's presented as a present, continuous, or active participle form.
Meaning it's not just that it was expanded way back when, but that the expansion is ongoing,
Yeah.
happening right now.
That's exactly the interpretation presented. It implies a continuous current process. And this leads to, well, a pretty pointed question the sources raise for you, the listener.
Which is,
How could a book from the 7th century possibly describe an ongoing expansion of the universe? Something only confirmed with powerful telescopes and complex calculations over 1,000 years later. That time gap is central to their point.
yeah, that definitely gives you pause thinking about the timeline involved. Okay, so we've got the unified start, the split, and this ongoing expansion. Do the sources highlight a third aspect of the early universe?
They do, yes. They look at the actual state or condition of the universe very early on. For this, they reference Surah Fusilat, chapter 41, verse 11.
Got it. And that one says,
Then he turned to the sky while it was smoke and said to it and to the earth, Come willingly or unwillingly. They said, we come willingly.
While it was smoke.
Yeah.
That's the key bit here, I'm guessing.
That's what the sources highlight. The Arabic word is dukan, meaning smoke. But they interpret it in this cosmological context not as like fire smoke,
Right, not literal smoke.
but more like a hot, dense, opaque, maybe turbulent gaseous state. Think primordial gas and dust before things cleared up.
And they connect that description, smoke or dukhan, to what modern science says about the very early universe.
They do. They argue it aligns well with our understanding just after the Big Bang, based on things like the cosmic microwave background radiation.
The CMB, right, this sort of leftover heat signature from that early time.
Exactly. That data suggests the universe was this incredibly hot, dense, opaque soup, a kind of plasma or fog, you might say, before stars and galaxies could even form.
And again, the sources emphasize that this scientific picture, confirmed by studying that background radiation.
It was completely inaccessible until we developed pretty sophisticated technology, right? Radio telescopes, space probes, things like that. Decades, even centuries after the Qur'an was revealed.
So it's another instance where they see this parallel between the text description and a much later scientific discovery.
That's the claim. So if you put it all together, the sequence the sources are presenting from these verses looks something like this in their interpretation.
Okay.
A single unified beginning from Surah 21.30.
Right, the rat call.
Followed by a violent separation or splitting, also from 21.30.
The Fataqahuma.
Then an ongoing continuous expansion from Surah 51.47.
The Muzian part.
And the whole thing starting out in this hot, dense, smoky state described in Surah 41.11.
Dukhan.
Yeah. So they're arguing that sequence drawn from different parts of the Quran mirrors the sequence of events understood through modern cosmology, specifically the Big Bang model and its aftermath.
That's the core framework the sources build. Specific verses, specific interpretations lined up against scientific concepts. Which leads us right to the kind of the main challenge or question these sources pose directly to you, the listener, right?
Absolutely. It boils down to, how could someone, anyone, living 1,400 years ago, without telescopes, without particle physics, without satellites, how could they possibly describe this specific sequence?
And these particular phenomena, the unified start, the split, the expansion, the smoky state, with what the sources argue is, well, startling accuracy.
Yeah. And the sources are careful, usually, to say the Quran isn't primarily a science book. Its main purpose, they state, is spiritual guidance. But they strongly suggest when you do look at the verses that touch on the natural world and you compare them openly to what science has found.
The parallels are too striking to just brush off as coincidence.
That's the implication. They leave it hanging there. Is it just chance? Or is it pointing towards, well, knowledge beyond human capabilities at that time?
That's the dilemma they present.
They really position these points as things to reflect on, especially if you're familiar with both the text and the science.
So this deep dive has really walked us through the specific claims in the material you sent. We've looked at how the sources interpret these key verses about a unified beginning, a cosmic split, the universe expanding, the early smoky state.
And how they connect those interpretations to concepts from Big Bang cosmology.
Yeah, and we've really tried to stick to presenting the specific points and arguments as they appear in the sources themselves.
Focusing on the verses they chose, the Arabic terms they highlighted, and the scientific ideas they brought in for comparison, just laying out what the material says.
And really, the sources leave us, and leave you, with this quite profound thought to mull over. If you accept these parallels they've presented between this ancient text and these modern discoveries,
Then the big question they pose isn't just, did the Quran describe the Big Bang?
no, it shifts, doesn't it? The question they leave you with is more like, who knew all this way back then before science even had a clue?
Exactly. And that's the question the sources ultimately invite you to ponder, based on everything we've just unpacked from the material.